Welcome to Media Mac. Dr. Shermak here. We are in week 14 if you're in the class. It's the second to last week of the semester. That's kind of hard to believe, but here we are. Last week's show was a first for the podcast. We had our very first guest, Professor Zach Gass, a political scientist over at Cuesta, along with me. We're in the same building, the 6200 building. We talked a lot about media and democracy. So if you missed the episode, strongly encourage you to go back and listen. It is a required assignment for those of you in class, because everything we talk about today is building on the conversation we had last week. So today is kind of what I call the legal stuff. All right. It's the First Amendment. It's libel. And another question we're now asking that isn't even being asked in your textbook, but we're going to talk about it here. First Amendment and artificial intelligence. Does AI have first speech rights? Which sounds really strange and probably sounds a little bit weirder than it actually is, but we'll dissect that. For those of you in the class, the reading this week is chapter 16 in Media and Culture. It is called Legal Controls and Freedom of Expression. Big chapter. Make sure you read it. Quick housekeeping before we get into the good stuff. The final exam opens this coming Sunday, May 17th. So I will create a finals guide for you and have that up here in week 14. Take a look at that. Make sure to get ready for the final exam. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the show. But let's get into it because this is a big topic. So before we go anywhere, I think it's really important to actually read you what the First Amendment says. Because almost nobody knows it, right? And no one knows it by heart. I mean, I could probably rattle it off because I deal with it so much. But we talk about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, all that, all the time in this country. It's a cornerstone for us. But I don't know if most people could tell you what it actually says. And I don't even mean recite it word from word. That'd be kind of bonkers. But I have the First Amendment actually hanging in the newsroom for the Questonian, the 6111 room in the 6100 building on Cuesta's campus. If you ever want to come see it, let me know. And here it is. Let me just give it to you. It's 45 words, super significant. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, end quote. 45 words. That's the whole thing. That's the entire First Amendment. And out of those 45 words, I think it's really important for you to understand those 5 freedoms that are mentioned. It's religion, it's speech, it's the press, it's assembly, and it's petition. Okay, those are massive and cornerstones of our society. And I can pretty much guarantee you those who are in the class that will show up on a quiz and or exam at some point. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Something that I love about the First Amendment, and I'm a big fan, I don't make any bones about it. My favorite thing about it is that the press is the only profession. What I do, what maybe you will do, it's the only profession mentioned in the entire U.S. Constitution. There's nothing in there about lawyers or doctors or soldiers even. No disrespect to any of those fields. The press is the only one mentioned. And I think the reason why, if you know your history, is pretty clear. The people who wrote that document had just fought a war against a government that controlled exactly what people could read, what reporters could write. They wanted the press protected. They knew way back when that the press would be an important part of this experiment we call democracy. That's vital. We can't forget that. The framers thought the press was so important to a working democracy that they put it in the founding document of this country. So when we talk about defending press freedom today, we're talking about defending something that the founders specifically put in the document. Let's fast forward a little bit and talk about some cases that really built modern press freedom. And they're both essential. So keep these in mind. You will read about them a little bit if you're in the class. The first one is the Pentagon Papers, okay? 1971. Let's talk a little bit about what happened here. A military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg, he leaks massive classified history of the Vietnam War to the New York Times. I mean, these papers really prove the United States government had been lying to the public for years about how the war was going. That is sounding a little familiar these days, but I will digress. The Times starts publishing these papers, what's in these papers, and the Nixon administration has a cow. All right, they go to court, they try to stop them, and they basically say, do not print any more of this. What's happening here is actually called prior restraint. It's the government trying to block publication before it happens. This can happen in any scenario. This can happen in smaller environments. This can happen at colleges and universities. Prior restraint, don't forget that term. The case here with the Pentagon Papers goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court rules in favor of the New York Times. Huge win for journalism, huge lesson for journalism, because it explicitly underscored the fact that in the United States, the government, generally speaking, cannot tell a newspaper to shut up before it publishes. Can't do it. The bar to do that is sky high. All right, it would have to be some, threat to the country or, some outward cause for harm to people, so on and so forth. It's a huge protection, and it's a big reason why the modern press is what it is. Another really important case, particularly for you if you are a student, even more so if you are a student journalist, and I love this case. Tinker versus Des Moines. It's got a fun name anyway, and a lot of people don't know how to say Des Moines. As their city tourism campaign says, in Des Moines, only the S is silent. I know that because they're a sponsor of Cubs baseball. Sidetracking. 1969, all right. A few students come to school wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. School doesn't like it. School suspends them, all right? Which I'm kind of glad these days that seems shocking, but maybe it isn't. I don't know. School suspends them. The students sue. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules for the students. Huge win. Huge win for the free speech. Huge win for students. Huge win ultimately for student media. The line from that case is, students do not, quote, shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, end quote. In other words, the freedom of speech you enjoy off campus, outside of the school building, doesn't go away when you come to school or come to campus. Why does this matter to you? Well, if you are a journalism student, whether it's at Cuesta College, working for the Questonian, please sign up and join us. Or for any student newspaper anywhere, if you transfer, or maybe you worked on your high school newspaper, Tinker is the case that protects all of you. It certainly has limits, okay? Schools can shut down your speech if it, disrupts education, poses a threat, so on and so forth. But the basic principle is there. You do not lose your free speech rights because you walked onto campus. It's a big deal. We talk a lot about the greatness, the protections of the First Amendment, but it's not a force field. There are things that it does not protect. And we have to define these categories very clearly to have a full understanding of it. So let's think about these, and we're going to talk a lot about these as we move through today's episode. Libel and slander. I'm going to hold off on those for the moment because segment 2 is all about that. All right. Obscenity. Obscenity is interesting. It has a very narrow legal definition. It's not really the same thing as something that is considered offensive. So you can see how the subjectivity there can be a little problematic when trying to maybe press an issue where obscenity is there. There's also the incitement to imminent lawless action. That's the fancy term for it. All right. You have a situation where you probably heard the line, like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that sort of thing. Right. So you have to be really careful with that. You don't want to cause huge problems, loss of life, threat to life, so on and so forth. So there are exceptions here. And we'll continue to discuss these throughout the episode. There is big news happening right now on the First Amendment front. I went over some of the foundational stuff. You'll read more about it in the chapter. But I want to bring you to today. And I'm feeling like this may change by the time I even publish this podcast. But there's a story happening right now that puts the First Amendment in sort of this real-time test. Most of you have maybe seen this headline, but weren't quite sure what it actually meant. So let's go through it. So on Friday, May 8th, so as I'm recording today, this is yesterday, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, ordered an early license renewal review for 8 ABC stations. ABC, American Broadcast Company, all right? You're probably familiar with their shows. They are owned by Disney. They've been around for a very long time. You have local ABC affiliates. Ours is out of Santa Barbara. You have, KABC out of LA, WABC out of New York. The ABC I grew up watching was WLS out of Chicago. Those stations are actually included in this license review. What does that actually mean? So every broadcast television station in the country operates under a license from the FCC. Why is that? Well, they're using public airwaves, right? It's almost like using a public road. There's regulations for it, but they belong to all of us. The FCC gives stations permission to broadcast on those airwaves. And those licenses are renewed on a regular schedule, usually about every 8 years. ABC's renewal was not due until 2028. The FCC just yesterday pulled it forward by 2 years. And guess what? It's unprecedented. It's never happened. So what is the context, right? The context is that this is happening after months of pressure from the FCC and their chairman, who is Brendan Carr. I've talked about him on the episode before. He will not be receiving a Shermak family Christmas card. He has applied pressure against ABC and its parent company, Disney, and it all started, and this is the part you probably know, with the Jimmy Kimmel monologue last September that the administration did not like. And I'm kind of losing count and losing track of the ones that the administration did not like. There were also complaints about the daytime show The View. And then there's also a fight over what is called the equal time rule, basically balancing opinion on television. And so all that has been happening, and now this. Now the sort of legal arm, the legal hammer drops on them. So ABC and Disney filed a petition with the FCC where they called all of this, quote, classic First Amendment retaliation, end quote. They say the FCC is using its regulatory power, that was the term I was going for, regulatory power to cool off speech they don't like. Senator Ed Markey, here I'm reading from the news story, which I'll post in our Going Deep page on Canvas. Ed Markey, a senator, he wrote a letter to the chairman calling it, quote, a mafia boss threat, end quote. Those are strong words from a sitting U.S. senator. I bring this up because I want to talk about why this matters. 2 points on this. First, this is what the First Amendment threats really look like in 2026. All right. Some of the things we think might happen in a moment, we talked about this on the podcast last week with Professor Gass. Some of the things we think might happen when democracy crashes, they don't. This is the stuff where we talked about it goes out with the whimper. There's no secret police raiding newsrooms. No one's burning down printing presses or dismantling them and throwing them in the street. What you have is a federal agency doing something extremely frickin' boring, but extremely impactful, trying to do a license review 2 years ahead of cycle and asking very pointed questions about the content on those shows, which just so happen to make the current president who appointed the FCC chair very unhappy. It's procedural. It's quiet. It is not must-see TV. But that's where the changes happen. The second point, and I want you to think back to last week with our guest, Professor Gass. He laid out the 5-step playbook for how democracies, or I should say authoritarian figures, dismantle a free press. And step 3, if you remember, was using regulation, using licenses, using existing rules that are already in place. That's exactly what's happening right here. I'm not here to tell you what to think about this. I'm telling you what to watch. All right. Keep an eye on this. As a journalism student, and you are, even if you're not a major, you need to understand that the First Amendment is just not some abstract thing in a textbook. It's being tested right now. It's really important to follow this and continue to pay attention. I know I will. And we will discuss it so long as we are in class because it's super important. So we got the First Amendment info established. Let's do this. Let's take a break. Let's come back and we're going to talk about libel. All right, libel, super important, especially for journalists. You're listening to Media Mac. I'm Dr. Shermak. Please come back.
Stay connected to your campus. The Questonian has been Cuesta College's trusted news source since 1966. From breaking news to campus life, we cover the stories that matter to you. Follow us at The Questonian on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, or visit questonian.com.
Welcome back to Media Mac. Dr. Shermak here. Thanks so much for joining us. It's a week 14 episode where we are talking about legal controls and expression. All right. And we're getting into segment 2. And this is all about libel. All right. Libel. I think libel is one of those words that people throw around a lot and they really don't know what the hell they're talking about. And they don't even name the word libel. Because I've been around journalism long enough to know that when someone writes something and a particular person isn't happy about it, the first thing they say is, I'm going to sue you. And they're trying for libel. They don't know what it is. And look, I don't want to dismiss cases where there is actually to be something to be sued for. But quite frankly, the threshold to achieve libel in a legal sense is really difficult to reach. And good journalism isn't doing it. All right. So let's talk through what it is. So libel is a false statement of fact. A lie. Lie, bull. I sounded like Costanza when he explains why manure is a beautiful word. Look it up on Google. I won't explain it. But it is when a false statement is presented as fact. And key to this, it's presented as fact and published or broadcast, and it damages someone's reputation. That's the basic definition of it. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it in a moment. I do want to make a distinction, though, because you hear this all the time. What is libel? What is slander? In the legal world, those are different. So again, libel is written or published, recorded somewhere. Slander is just spoken. Same kind of family, just different forms. The law mostly still uses this distinction, even though in the digital age, that's become a little bit blurred. We'll discuss that as well. But what's really important here is this threshold for libel. It's kind of a 4-part test. So let's talk through it and think about it. In order for something to be libel, all 4 of these things have to be true. All 4. Not 2 of 4, not 3 of 4, all 4. First one, it's a false statement that is presented as fact. Very important distinguishment here. Opinion is not libel. If you go on to Rate My Professor, and please do, by the way, if you go on to Rate My Professor and just be like, Shermak sucks, that guy sucks, 0 out of 5 stars or whatever they do. Okay, that's your opinion. I can't sue you for that. I can't sue you for publishing it. It's an opinion. If I say someone stole money from their department, that is a statement of fact. Or they stole money or they embezzled money from financial aid. That's a statement of fact. And it could be libel, but the other things need to be true. This is the biggest one. The statement has to be published. On a newspaper, a website, it could be broadcast. It can be a social media post. We've seen that. It doesn't necessarily have to be in print. That's the digital advancement of this. Even a tweet or an X or whatever the hell we're calling it these days counts. Third part, it has to damage the person's reputation. There needs to be some kind of harm that can be demonstrated in court. Has to actually hurt them in some way. That's another big deal. And fourth, it has to be made with negligence or what we call malice, actual malice. We'll talk more about malice in a second. But you can see libel is a big deal, and libel needs to be proven in all 4 of those ways. It's pretty hard to prove, to be really honest with you, when you think about those 4 elements. Libel is super important because it's the main daily threat that journalists face every day. Every working reporter in this country, myself included, not only as a working reporter when I did that, but as a faculty advisor to a student newspaper. I deal with some kind of libel-related accusation a few times a month. I first started learning about libel when I was 16 and I had my first newspaper job. My editor at the Harbor Country News, Dave Johnson, talked about this a lot. And he didn't actually really name the word libel because I was a kid. I didn't know what it meant. But now I do. And he explained it to me in the way he trained me. Get the names right, get the spelling right, get the quotes right. Because if you don't do that, you open yourself up to the possibility of what I later learned to know as libel. And that can cost the paper, that can cost me or any journalists individually, their job. So this is where journalism is truly a craft. It takes discipline. You got to check and recheck, verify, triangulate, all those fun words. This is the pressure of libel doing that to a working reporter. And I think it's also part of why journalism is much harder than people think. You have to have receipts. You have to demonstrate intent by doing the hard work, asking the questions. Let's talk about the most important libel case in U.S. history. New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964. I think you can make the case, we talked about the Pentagon Papers in segment 1. I think you can make the case that Sullivan might do more, or may have had a bigger influence on day-to-day journalism than the Pentagon Papers. But I'll let you decide. Let me talk about what happened. So the New York Times ran a paid ad by civil rights activists. And the ad criticized how police in Montgomery, Alabama were treating civil rights protesters. Now, in this ad, some of the details, the accusations were wrong. Not big picture stuff, but details. So the Montgomery Police Commissioner, the guy named L.B. Sullivan, there's the Sullivan name, he sued the Times for libel. And an Alabama jury awarded him $500,000, which in 1964 is a crazy amount of money, right? That's a big win. Because of that, if that ruling stands, the New York Times is bankrupt. And every other paper in the country is going to look at that and say, whoa, they got the Times? They're for sure going to get us. Not because they were doing bad journalism, but because the court really lowered the bar for libel in this situation. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reversed the decision unanimously, slam dunk. And they created a brand new standard. And the brand new standard was for public officials. This is a little different when applied to private citizens, but for public officials, you cannot win a libel case unless you can prove actual malice. Let's get into actual malice a little bit, because it gets misunderstood all the time. Actual malice does not mean that the writer was mean to you. It doesn't mean that they hated you or anything like that. Actual malice basically breaks down into two specific things. Either the publisher knew the statement was false, or they published it with reckless disregard for whether it was true. In other words, they were actively being jerks, or they didn't do their homework to make sure it was true. Again, it's a really high bar, but it kind of has to be high, because if it wasn't, every politician in America would just sue every reporter who covered them honestly. The entire watchdog function of journalism, which is massive in this democracy, would be tossed out the window. The Sullivan case was later actually extended from not only public officials, but to public figures. So this now includes celebrities, business leaders, et cetera, et cetera. Anyone who puts them in the public eye. Something to remember, be on the lookout now. The Sullivan ruling is actually under attack at the Supreme Court right now. Justice Clarence Thomas, Justice Neil Gorsuch have both said publicly they want to revisit the standard. That's a 5-alarm fire, gang. If Sullivan goes away or just gets a little weakened, political journalism in this country changes dramatically and quickly. Pay attention to that one. I want to give you a recent libel case. They're pretty rare, but they happen. A recent libel case to show you how all this works in practice. Sarah Palin. Many of you may remember her. She was John McCain's running mate in 2008. Hope I got that right. Republican vice presidential candidate from Alaska. She can see Russia from her backyard, she said very famously. Sarah Palin versus the New York Times. The New York Times ran an editorial back in 2017 that created and kind of drew a connection between Palin and the mass shooting in Arizona where Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot and miraculously survived. You may remember that. The connection was wrong. The Times made an error. They corrected it within hours of its publication, but Palin sued anyway. Sort of this idea of you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. And that case has been bouncing around different courts for many years. But more recently, the Times actually won. And then Palin appealed again. This matters because this is the sort of thing that Sullivan, the standard that Sullivan created was designed to handle a public figure, an honest editorial mistake, because mistakes happen. They do. And it was corrected quickly. There was no evidence that the Times knew it was false. They were not acting with malice. They made an error. And the Times won. Palin lost, and the system worked. But here's the interesting thing. Even when you win a libel case, you still spend years and millions of dollars defending yourself. There's still a really chilling effect on the reporting, the reporters, the institution. Let's go to another libel case that's quite famous. Dominion voting system versus Fox News. So in 2020, after the presidential election, Fox News broadcast a series of false claims about Dominion voting machines being rigged, taken over from foreign actors, all kinds of, I'll use a really fancy word here, all kinds of crap that has never once been proven, even though it's still pushed by some political leaders. I won't name names. The claims were entirely false. We know they were false. We knew then they were false. And here's the killer for Fox News. There are internal Fox News messages, emails, and texts between hosts and producers that show Fox News knew the claims were false at the time and ran them anyway. Actual malice. You should share this with your crazy uncle who still watches Fox News. It's not a news source. It's another podcast. I'm salty today. Dominion sued for defamation. So this is big because it's a big company, a impactful company running voting machines, suing a big network that's still, unfortunately, the most watched cable news network. In April 2023, before the case even went to a jury, because Fox News knew it would get ugly, they settled. Here's what's wacky. The settlement amount, $787 million. Remember I talked about the $500K in 1964? That is not equivalent, a modern day equivalent dollar amount. $787 million. It's the largest defamation settlement in American history against Fox News. This case is the actual malice part of libel in action. Fox was, a public outlet. They made claims about this company Dominion, which is a public business, and the bar was to show that there was actual malice, and there was evidence of it. Fox cleared that pretty hard to achieve bar. It wasn't a mistake. It was orchestrated. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they ran it anyway. So I think the lesson here is that libel is not dead. It's rare. The system is in place for good reason. But Sullivan versus New York Times is not a free pass to lie about people. We know that, right? But if you knowingly publish something false, the lesson here is that the system will eventually catch up with you. And yes, it even happened to the biggest cable network in the country. When we come back for segment 3, we're going to get into something that I haven't discussed yet in this class since I've been teaching it since 2009. We're going to talk about AI and the First Amendment. What's going on there? It's a complex mishmash. We will dissect the mishmash when we come back for segment 3. I'm Dr. Shermak. You're listening to Media Mac.
Want real journalism experience? Join the Questonian. Build your portfolio, develop professional skills, and tell the stories that matter to our campus. Enroll in JOUR 202 or 203 for 4 credits. Questions? Email thequestonian@questa.edu. The Questonian. Your story starts here.
Welcome back. It is segment 3. Dr. Shermak here. This is Media Mac. We're talking First Amendment, libel, all these legal mechanisms that affect journalism here in the US of A. We're in the last segment of the show, and this still is like a really strange topic to cover, but I think we have to talk about it. So the First Amendment was written in 1791, all right? What is that, 15 years after the country was founded? And it was written with quill pens, in print shops with handset type. I mean, it was very, it looks nothing like the world that we live in today. And now in 2026, we're asking a question about that document that would have sounded insane to the framers. Does artificial intelligence have free speech rights? Did they even know about robots then? I don't know. Did they think about them? It sounds silly, but this is actually in a federal court right now. Let's talk about that. There's an AI company out there called Anthropic. You might be familiar with them if you use the service Claude. I use Claude. I like Claude. I'll talk more about my AI use in a bit. Anthropic had a $200 million contract with the Pentagon. Okay, a contract with the Pentagon. Claude was going to be the first major AI system approved for use on classified, big word there, approved for use on classified United States government networks. Well, the negotiations fell apart at some point. The Pentagon wanted the contract to allow them to use Claude for, quote, all lawful purposes, end quote, whatever that means. And Anthropic said, no way, won't do it. So what's actually happening here is Anthropic specifically refused to allow Claude to be used for 2 things. Number 1, autonomous weapons. I think that's good that they didn't allow that. Number 2, mass domestic surveillance of American citizens without warrants. Can we sit with that for a second? Your government said, hey, can we use your service to attack people with automatic weapons powered by AI? And the AI people said no. Then they said, hey, can we use your AI systems to surveil domestically in this country our own citizens? And the AI said no. A lot of y'all have some strong feelings on AI, but I think this is AI standing up for something that is right. Anthropic said flat out, we will not let our AI be used for those things, period. They referred to their usage policy. They said, we don't do that. The Trump administration was ticked off. Trump posted on Truth Social. He said that all federal agencies must immediately stop using Anthropic's products. Then the Pentagon jumped in and they designated Anthropic as a, quote, supply chain risk, end quote. That's a really important label. It's been used in the past to designate foreign adversaries, Chinese telecom companies, so on and so forth. It had never been used on an American company like Anthropic before, until now. So Anthropic sued. And I think their argument is really important to why this case matters. They said this is First Amendment retaliation. They used the First Amendment in their lawsuit. They said the government is punishing us, Anthropic, for saying we will not allow our technology to be used in a certain way. And the government cannot punish you for what you say. Really interesting. In late March, a federal judge here in California, her name is Rita Lynn, she agreed with Anthropic. And she granted a preliminary injunction. She said, I'm reading from the story here, the Pentagon's actions looked like, quote, classic illegal First Amendment retaliation, end quote. So this case continues, but there's a precedent in motion that's already really big that's having an impact. There's a court out there treating an AI company's decisions about its own product as protected speech. Fascinating. So it kind of leads us to a bigger question. Is AI output itself speech? So wacky, such a weird conversation. Let's forget Anthropic for a moment. Forget the lawsuit, all that. I think there's a bigger question here that this case opens up. Hang with me here. If you ask a chatbot a question and the chatbot gives you an answer, is that answer constitutionally protected speech? There's a guy out there, his name's Daniel Lyons. He's at the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote a piece in March that makes the case that, yes, this AI output is protected speech. Let me give you his argument. He says the Supreme Court has already protected lots of non-human speech, corporate speech, anonymous speech, fictional speech, even the interactive output of video games. That's in the case Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association. Let me see. Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association from 2011. Sometimes I have a hard time reading my own notes, guys. That protected video games as speech. The First Amendment does not say, does not say that the speech it protects has to come from a human being. It's only required that speech communicates something. Nothing about its origin. Here's the part that's even more interesting, I think. The First Amendment does not just protect the right to speak, it also protects your right to receive information. And there was actually a case on this that set precedents. 1976, called Virginia Pharmacy. That's the case. And it was about prescription drug prices. So the court basically said that people have the right to receive accurate pricing information separate from any pharmacy's right to share it. This is why I'm not a lawyer. There's a lot of funky precedents in here. But basically what we have here is if you ask a chatbot for medical information, for example, or legal advice, and the government tries to restrict that, you might have a First Amendment claim. And it's not because the AI has rights treating it like a human. It's because you have the right to receive information. Think about that. The right is yours as the human, not the machine's. I think that's going to be a really interesting cornerstone of a lot of legal AI challenges going forward. You want to keep an eye on that because that's really funky. So how does this relate to journalism? I think that's super important to think about, as always, because this is a journalism class. Let's bring it home to journalism. There's a real fight happening inside the profession right now about AI. And when I talk to industry professionals at conferences or people I know who work in the industry, they unequivocally tell me, have your students be ready to use AI. And then when I come to the classroom and I tell my students, hey, we need to start using AI, and I'm a little more specific about it, I have ideas, students hate it. And then I'm sitting there thinking, man, what do I do here? I don't want to torture my students, but I also want them to be prepared. How do we use it? How do we use it fairly? How do we use it ethically? How do we use it productively? And how do we not cancel ourselves as journalists while we're using it? I'm still thinking of those answers. I'm still trying to figure all that out. ProPublica, right? ProPublica is a really well-known, highly respected investigative outlet. They do incredible work. They are a not-for-profit outlet, which I think is super cool. Right now, they're in a contract fight with its journalists' union, and I think journalists' unions are excellent. The union wants to have written guarantees about AI. So like disclosure when AI is used, making sure that there are humans involved in the work. They don't want any AI-driven layoffs where you punch some numbers in and AI tells you to lay off a third of your photography staff and 2/3 of your opinion editors, things like that. ProPublica's leadership is saying, no, we don't want to put any of that in writing because this technology is moving so quickly. We don't really want to cancel out what could be used down the road. This has gone as far as the union voting to authorize a strike, and this is still developing. If it happens, it will be the first journalism strike in this country where AI is the central issue. And I want to emphasize central because AI has been, part of other labor stoppages in recent, maybe the most famous was the Hollywood, the writer's strike, that sort of thing. It's a big deal. Here's kind of a more, disturbing example. So the Plain Dealer is located in Cleveland. The Cleveland Plain Dealer is their newspaper. There's an editor there. His name is Chris Quinn. And he wrote a column defending a practice there at the Plain Dealer. Let me tell you what they did. So they sent reporters out to interview people. The reporters took notes like they normally would. When they came back, they fed those interview notes to AI. And AI wrote the article. A human edited it before it got published, but the writing itself was generated by AI. Think about that for a moment. They're still doing the reporting, which I think is a really big deal to have a human in the room. But the writing, the part that this is where journalists as humans make choices about how to tell the story, the words to use, what is the lead, what quotes to use. All that stuff has been done by a machine. I have a lot of thoughts about that. You can probably guess what they are. What's interesting about this is what I'm calling the disclosure paradox. I feel very proud of myself for inventing that term, and I probably didn't. I was looking at some research for my show prep. This is from, let me get the name, Benjamin Toff at the Minnesota Journalism Center. It's really interesting research because what Toff found is that the vast majority of Americans say it's important for newsrooms to disclose when AI is used in a story. Couldn't agree more. Our policy with the Questonian, for example, must disclose if AI is used in any way. But here's the catch, and this is the paradox that I'm talking about. That was the disclosure. Here's the paradox. When newsrooms do disclose, when they say supported by AI or collaborated with AI or whatever, readers trust those stories less, not more. And about 30% of Americans say AI should not be used in journalism at all. Usually when we put a disclosure statement in a story, we feel really good about ourselves in the newsroom because we feel transparent. Hey, we're showing them how the sausage is made. It doesn't work with AI. Those disclosure statements make the public trust us less. That's a really tough spot for a newsroom. So you disclose and you lose trust, but if you don't disclose, if it gets out somehow that you were using AI, I'd wonder if you'd lose even more trust. That also seems unethical. So there's no real answer to this. And industry educators like myself are trying to figure it out here in real time. So let me talk a little bit about AI use for me. I really do practice what I preach when I say that AI is a support and not a replacement. I use AI to help me out, developing ideas, developing course materials, exercises for my students, particularly for my in-person classes. I use it to help me develop rubrics. But I don't use it to replace myself. I don't use it for grading. I don't use it to generate initial ideas for classes or the structure of my classes. I actually have made the decision for the fall, actually the summer semester and the fall semester and going forward to disclose exactly how I use AI to my students. Even saying this right now in the wake of just sharing Toff's information, I feel like I'm doing a good thing. But I now wonder what you're thinking out there and what my students will think out there that that, yeah, I use AI and I use AI for these purposes. I don't know how that will land, but I feel ethically inclined to do it. And here's even the harder part. You talk about a paradox. The paradox is I don't allow you to use AI on your student work. And I'm not going to change that policy. Full disclosure, in 2023 and 2024, I worked in the AI industry as a writer and what they call a prompt engineer. And my job was to write and more often read prompts and responses from AI to check them for accuracy, tone, danger, that sort of thing. I was at a point in my life when, I'll be quite honest, I needed some money, and it was really good money. And they were only hiring folks with advanced degrees, expertise in certain areas. It felt like a good niche spot for me. I enjoyed it. I saw the AI train coming. I knew I couldn't stop it. So I got on, hoping to shape it to be a little bit better. And yeah, make some money. I'm not ashamed of that work. It taught me a lot about AI, what it can be in both good and bad ways. It's all about the objective, right? What you need it to do, what you want it to do. But not just the objective of the tool, the objective of you as the human. I hope you are here to train your brain, to work your brain, to think. I want you to learn how to think, how to write, how to interview people, how to figure out what matters in a story, how to figure out what matters when you read something. That's our read and react. AI can imitate that output and pretend that there's someone that already has those skills, but it can't give you those skills. In class, I want you to build those skills. And in journalism specifically, the job is the reporting. The job is showing up. It's showing up. It's asking the hard follow-up questions after you give them a softball. It's being in the room and reading the room. AI can't read the room. AI can't show up. It doesn't ask the follow-up questions. The First Amendment will probably, and it kind of sounds like it already is, extend to AI in some form. And I think it probably should in some way. I don't know what that is quite yet. But I think protected and what is good for journalism are two different things. And those two different things are different conversations. The bottom line is that we need to learn to live with AI in our lives. I think the outright rejection of it, the ick factor that I always talk about, is a mistake. I hear you on the environmental impact. I hear you on, the brain rot. I am very concerned about those things. But we have to engage and have discussions on it and not just ick it away. Quick recap of our episode today. We talked about the First Amendment, those 45 super important words, the 5 freedoms involved with it. The press is the only profession in the Constitution, which I've always thought was super cool. We talked about some key case studies. I'll list those in our Going Deep page on our website. We talked about the unprecedented pressure the FCC is applying to television stations. And we also talked about AI. And I'm always happy to answer your questions on AI or any of the things we've discussed. Your deliverables for this week, for those of you who are in the class, read chapter 16 in the Media and Culture book, Legal Controls and Freedom of Expression. We also have our discussion for this week. We have our second to last Read and React and our very last quiz, which is exciting. Don't forget the final exam opens on Sunday, May 17th. You'll have the entire finals week, which is up until May 22nd, to complete it. Don't wait till the last day. You won't have fun if you do that. I'll have more information posted on our Canvas page. Next week's episode is the last one of the semester. We have made it. We'll have a wrap up on the course. I want to thank you so much for listening today. We talked a lot about some big issues, some really important issues. Reach out with questions. Use the Ask Me Anything board. And above all, take care of yourself and those around you. I'm Dr. Shermak. This has been Media Mac. So long, everybody.